In order to get our afternoon rolling, I'd like to ask Sandy Pentland to come up to the stage. Sandy, I'm sure you all know of him. He is the most cited social scientist on the planet Earth. I will point out that although your commute was the least, you showed up the latest today.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, we're happy to have you. Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, good. So let's see if we can get this rolling here. Oh, my. So could you show the PowerPoint instead? Well, we have a problem here. Do you want me to just start? You guys can pretend? Okay. Yeah, right. I gotta be super clever here. Okay, good. So what I was going to talk about was sort of the evolving ecology of data. And the idea there is that a lot of the underpinnings for what you think of as your IT infrastructure or big data are changing, and they change rapidly. And it's worth paying a little attention to, because just like the last talk, which is, oh my God, they're going to take over my job, the character of the job, the character of the business is going to change because of some of the other things that are happening in other parts of the technology. And I hope to sort of give you some senses of some of these things and a little context for stuff that you might be interested in. So one of the big things that's happening, and I think Sinan's talk was a good example, is that suddenly we have all this big data, and we're beginning to use that to be able to understand human behavior in ways that we haven't done before. So Sinan talked about doing experiments to get at the fundamental effects. Is this a causal thing? What is the role of influence? Things like that. But many companies, and I'm on the board or consult for many of these companies, are using it to build really interesting models of human behavior. And this is sort of a lot of the big data revolution, is a lot of the things you think of as marketing, a lot of the things you think of as how you will structure your product or segment it or anything like that are being taken over by things that are much more data-driven. And I want to just talk a little bit about that, because we're involved in a lot of these things too. One of the things, though, that people aren't doing and is beginning to happen is ways of understanding this data that make it more powerful. So unlike the last talk, which talked about taking data, finding patterns, sometimes there are patterns that go across data sources. And if you have the patterns that go across data sources, you can do things that are not possible by just looking at the particular data sources you have. It gives you a prior or a context for understanding data. And I want to show you a couple of examples of that and sort of talk about some of the implications of that. So I'm going to really have 3 separate talks here that are hopefully connected in an interesting way. So let's see. Okay, so this is the first bit. Is one of the things we've been doing for quite a while is things that are in between what Sinan talked about and what most companies do. So what we're doing is taking entire communities, giving them all cell phones, signing them up as experimental subjects, and recording who they talk to, what they do on the phone, what they buy, where they sleep, how well they sleep. We put EKGs on them, right? EEGs rather on them. What they do on Yahoo, and sort of getting a complete digital snapshot of their life. And out of that complete digital snapshot, we find patterns that you might not have expected. And these patterns help us interpret other data. So an example of such a pattern is shown here. And what I'm going to explain it to you as, if you look at brain structure in humans, there's really old parts of our brain that we share with all the mammals. So for instance, there's also parts that are even older than that, but the sort of basic mammalian brain. And then there's a layer on top of it that's typified by the cortex, which you see only in certain apes and in humans. And if you talk to a neuroanatomist or a neurophysiologist, they'll tell you that in humans, a lot of our habitual behavior, the things that we don't really think about, we just sort of go on automatic, are handled by the older structures. And novelty is something that engages these newer structures. And what we find is when we look at this sort of behavior of individuals in these communities, where we have this sort of complete snapshot, we get to see things that look a lot like that. So we see that, in fact, you can predict people's behavior from after watching them for a week or two with extremely high accuracy. What that means is that a lot of what you do every day is very routine. It's constrained by your environment, and hence it's predictable. And it's not just where you go, it's who you hang out with, where you eat. All sorts of things are very predictable. And then there are these gaps in what you do that are very unpredictable, where you go out and you do something completely different. Saturday morning you go out and you're just looking for new things. So you go shopping in a new place, or you just take a break and you're sort of wandering around someplace you've never been. It's like there's this sort of basic need for novelty. And I can tell you a lot more about this, because it turns out that if you're going to motivate people, you need to know which mode the people are in. So normal economic behavior is something that works pretty well with this habitual behavior, if you're going to incent changing of the routine things. But the routine things don't change. You don't get new routines because of economic incentives. Typically, it's much more powerful to have social incentives if you're going to talk about actually changing the routines rather than the frequency of the routines. The novelty, on the other hand, is very different. It's something where you can add new explorations to people pretty easily using either economic things or using social things. And that's why coupons help to be able to get people to try something. It doesn't mean it turns into a habit, though, right? What's interesting, though, we've noticed is that if you also have medical data or longer-term financial data, you see an interesting pattern, and that is that people seem to need a balance of this novelty and the habitual. And when that balance breaks down, that means that they're under a great deal of stress in one way or another, and one of a couple of things are happening. So in the first study we did, we looked at all the people in a small living community, and we discovered that there are certain sorts of decompositions or degradations of habits that are indicative of getting sick. So this is something where you don't wake up at the same time, you don't move around as much, you call different people, and it turns out that different types of being sick have different signatures. So there's the way you normally are, and this is consistent across people. It's not individual. There's certain sorts of breaking down of habits that's indicative of being depressed. Other sort of breaking downs of habits that are indicative of getting the flu. And other things are like you ate the wrong stuff, okay? And this has turned into something that is now a spin-off company. It's primarily funded by Kaiser Permanente. And it has that wonderful quote from the Chief Technical Officer of the United States that this is an innovation that will save our health system. And the idea is this, is that Kaiser Permanente has millions and millions of people that they supply health services to. They know that at any one moment, any one day, there are thousands of them that are getting seriously ill, but they have no idea which ones. And they won't know until those guys get really, really sick and show up at an emergency room or go to the hospital. If they could know when they were getting sick, they could give them a telephone call and intervene early, and it would be dramatically cheaper and dramatically more effective. And that's what Todd meant when he said this, right? Is that if you can have a check engine light that says, oh, by the way, you seem to be sort of falling apart here. What's going on? And somebody gives you a phone call and gets you in to see a doctor, you can change the outcome dramatically. And that's why Kaiser invested in this. Right? It turns out we've been able to show with financial data that you can do the same thing for financial difficulties. So using a database of 1.2 million people in a sort of mid-tier country where it's all geolocated, so we know where people are buying things and where they're going, it turns out that we can beat the banks in terms of predicting when someone's going to be in financial trouble in the next 3 months by looking at how their habits degrade. So not what they're buying, but where they're buying it. How much novelty is there? Are they keeping their rhythm, their normal daily rhythm, or is that beginning to fall apart? And using that, we can beat the financial indicators that the bank currently uses operationally by almost 50%. And what that suggests is that you may be able to reach out there also and say, looks like you're, having a hard time here. You're not doing what you normally do. Is there something we can do to help? Can we talk about this before you completely fall off the rails and we have to go through bankruptcy or something like that? Pretty interesting. Now, by doing lots of experiments like this, we've been able to do some interesting things. We've noticed some commonalities among these things, which have ramifications for machine learning. It's a spin-off company called Endor. It's funded by Eric Schmidt, who's the chairman of Google. And we call it big data without PhDs. So what it's doing is it's using this general knowledge about human behavior, like this habit to novelty ratio, to be able to analyze data. So one of the big problems with big data is you need big training. You need a lot of data to be able to do anything. And it's fiddly. You need really smart people like the last speaker who know a lot of the insights to make it happen. This is more like a spreadsheet. You aim data at it, you hit carriage return, it gives you an answer. Now, it's not the best answer, but it's right up there, right? And it doesn't work with jet engines and the stuff like that. It only works with people. But things like we could beat Twitter at predicting which tweets would go viral. We could beat the largest financial trading tool system in the country, predicting churn, and Kaggle, which does these competitions. So we can come in like the top 1%. But notice that it's like 60 seconds of labor as opposed to a bunch of PhDs working night and day to, whatever. And that probably has some real consequences. I think there's still going to be a lot of jobs for data scientists. I'm not too worried, right? Anyway, so I thought I'd say that. The second thing I want to talk about, and I have to watch the time here, I guess, is doing things with these digital breadcrumbs at scale for societal systems. So digital breadcrumbs are the things that are, your phone leaves little location fixes, your credit card leaves little traces. All these digital systems leave little breadcrumbs behind. And the things I just talked about are making use of that to do science to understand human behavior in a deeper way. But you can also use those to build better transportation systems, build better insurance systems, build better electric systems. And so we've been doing things to progress towards that. And a lot of this work is done with the UN, World Economic Forum, the GSMA, and similar sorts of international things. So principally through Orange, the carrier, but those other partners, World Economic Forum, et cetera, we've been collecting and releasing dense data for entire countries. So the first one we did was Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa. So we had all of the phone records for a year, all of the financial transactions, all of the government data, all the internal structure, all the disease and health records, all the crime statistics for the entire country for a whole year in one place. And what that lets you do is look for patterns across these different systems. Now, to do that also, we had to be very careful about how we anonymize the data and how we shared it, because what we did with this is we made it available to academics anywhere. And in the end, we had over 90 academic groups using this data to do various sorts of data for good type things. And I'll just point out a couple. One is, one group was, and this is the IBM group from Ireland, the Smart Cities group, was able to analyze this data and figure out how to reduce the commute time in the capital city by 10%. Not by buying new buses, but by just putting them in the right spot, right? Because it turns out they didn't know where people lived and where they worked. And if you knew that, it was obvious that some of the bus routes were bad. Similarly, the public health system was, put its resources in the wrong spot. Nothing sophisticated here. They just didn't know where people lived, where they mixed. And so they didn't know how infectious disease would propagate. And by fixing that, they estimate that they can get something like a 20% reduction in the rate of spread of infectious disease, which you can imagine being sort of important. Here's another thing. So I'm on the advisory board for Telefonica, for the board of directors. And I convinced O2 to release its data, again in this sort of anonymized aggregate form that's proven to be quite safe, for London and the area around metropolitan London, for the Christmas and first month of last year. And along with that, we had crime statistics, we had the London Underground, we had traffic data, things like that. And groups from around the world analyzed this data, and embarrassingly, one of my groups won. This is, you're not supposed to win your own contest, but we did. It was fair. But what we found is you could actually predict crime rates like a month in advance. And this is not like the stuff they're doing in Chicago or LA, where they take criminals and then they look at who their friends are and they go and interview the friends and stuff. No, this is completely anonymous data. And what it's doing is it's looking for demographic shifts. So using, for instance, cell tower level data, you can ask questions like, are the people in this city square from lots of different cities? Are they having lots of different age categories? Are they gender balanced? And let's imagine you find squares where it used to be that way, but now say all the elders stopped coming. Well, what are you going to think? Under what circumstances does it happen that all the older people decide that this is not a place to go? Well, quite often that's a place that has heightened risk of crime. And that's exactly what we find. Another interesting thing in there is it resolves a century-old debate in sociology, or at least goes a long way to resolving it, which is what is safer? Something where it's all the locals out on the street, or where it's people from all over? And it turns out that the more diverse communities are the safer communities. Okay? The other sort of standard trope you hear is that, oh, when there's a lot of young people, that's bad news. And it turns out that's a little bit bad news, right? But only a little. Nothing like having just people from the community. So you can use this to begin to engineer things. And last year, I was asked to be part of a special committee for the UN Secretary General. And the goal there was what can we do with big data like this to achieve what are called the Sustainable Development Goals. So how many people know what the Millennium Development Goals are? Okay, so 15 years ago, year 2000, the UN set out 15 goals called Millennium Development Goals, which were things like reducing poverty and infant mortality and et cetera, right? And they did pretty good over the last 15 years. All the countries in the world signed up to this. It's shocking that people don't know what it is, but there you are. All the aid agencies signed up for this. And it turned out they did really pretty well on some of them and completely blew it on others. And they noticed that the ones that they couldn't measure were the ones that they blew. If you could measure it, then you could embarrass the minister of X into why aren't you, doing a better job, and people would begin asking questions, and so it would change. If you couldn't measure it, Why not just do business as usual? And so this time around, they're setting the goals for 2030, and they wanted to know, what can we do? And the obvious thing is you have to be able to measure these things. And the sort of techniques I've just shown you are the sort of things that give you hope to being able to measure things like ethnic violence, gender inequality, income disparities, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is actually what the UN is now committing and member countries are committing themselves to do. So every national statistical office in the world is now sort of in a tizzy because they've been given this new charge to do something that they haven't done ever before in their last sometimes 150 years of history, which is begin measuring really broad characteristics of society and sustainability. I think that's a really tremendous thing. It's really interesting that the world is moving to something that has much greater transparency and accountability. You can imagine a world where all the things you might care about are actually quantified and in the newspaper every week, because it's not expensive to compute this stuff. To mirror the discussion just before me, though, let me put up a vision that should scare you, because it scares me, which is I'm not so worried about AI. I am worried about this. Because if you begin building social systems, the government now becomes driven by data. Imagine a government that's purely automatic, right? It says, oh, you know, gender inequality is up 0.1%. That means we have to, you know, I don't know, do what? Something. And imagine that that gets a little out of control, right? It could be pretty scary, right? Everybody know what Skynet is? Yeah, okay. We're talking about building Skynet here, right? You know, something that's going to control the world. That's going to take a long time to happen. But we have to sort of think about how are the humans going to play an important role in this. And I think the way to think about it is that no matter how many of these things you measure, you're still going to need humans as sensors. Does it feel good? Are you happy? Do you feel good for your kids? Those sorts of things have to be input into the system still. And stakeholders have to be part of it. So imagine that you had an automatic system like this, and you were in Rwanda 15 years ago, and a bad guy comes to power and says, I don't like these Tutsis. Computer, tell me where they all are and infect their water. Well, you know, last time around they killed 800,000 of them. This time around it could be a lot more, right? So you really want to think about this because when you talk about putting AI or data in the government, remember who has the guns, right? The government has the guns. So you're talking about AI with guns on a big scale. Do think about it. Anyway, so I have 7 minutes left here. I want to talk about some other things, starting with things like this. So we had a paper in Science this year showing that it is generically possible to de-anonymize data. So what does that mean? That means that, for instance, in the medical system, you always anonymize data and share it with, you know, suppliers or testers or things, and probably you do this in the insurance agency. Many businesses have to share data for data analysts. And increasingly this is so in the sort of big data era. And people are also trying to share data with other companies as part of a broader business. And the base of that is that, well, we're going to anonymize the data and blah, 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 right? And what we were able to show is that that's BS. There is no such thing almost always, okay? Which means in some parts of the world, it's illegal today. What you're doing is illegal today, right? And in this country, it's likely to become illegal, which means a lot of the systems you already have out there are going to have to change. So I was very proud that this particular paper was the one major citation in the recent court case that banned mass collection by the National Security Agency. So this paper basically said they can't do that. right? Because it's not just anonymous data. It's got all sorts of things in there. And so it's great, did something interesting. So point that out. You want to think about that if your company uses anonymized data. The other thing is this business here, and I had a panel on this yesterday at the CIO conference if you were there. So this is by the head of the National Security Agency right after the Snowden affair got in the news. The failure originated from two practices, and nobody ever guesses what the first one is. But the most important one is they put all the data in one spot. When the data is in one spot, the bad guys know where to go. It's like, this is a really bad idea. Not only that, but once they get in, and remember it's insiders often that get in, they're already in, right? They can do stuff without you knowing because they're not breaking in, they're already there, right? So what do you have to do? Well, what you have to do is you have to keep data where it lives, not bringing it all into one spot. And you can't rely on anonymizing data, because that doesn't work. Somehow you have to do local computation with data where it lives in a way that's fully secure. And I don't know if I have the time or this is the right audience to go into the technical details, but we've been doing a lot of work in this area, working with some of the really great people here at MIT, the Kerberos Internet Trust Consortium, raise your hand. Hey, there we are. And who are the ones that provide the basic security for the internet to try and fix this big problem, okay? And the key thing is if you're going to have a secure infrastructure in the future, you can't bring data to the analysts. You have to bring the models to the data. Okay, so the data lives where it was collected and where it needs to be for operations. You don't share it ever, not even anonymized. And somehow you concentrate the data. And we're developing systems to do that. We have a number of things with DARPA. DARPA's putting a lot of money in this. And given the time, I'm just going to mention that we have a couple big projects, Big Data at Earth, which is trying to develop open source versions of this sort of way of thinking that you can put into existing systems to make them safer from these two types of threats, sort of this next generation security and also privacy concerns at the same time. And the other thing that is part of this whole sort of architecture, and I'm not going to have time to mention it, we'll do more than mention it, which is there are new technologies that are coming along that are really interesting and we'd be happy to talk to you about, like, for instance, Bitcoin. And you might say, well, Bitcoin? What's that crazy thing, right? You know, why is that interesting? Well, I personally don't think Bitcoin is that interesting, but the parts of Bitcoin are really interesting. In particular, the blockchain. You probably have heard this, but I'll say it again. Blockchain is a trustless open ledger. That means you can have bad guys out there, and you can still keep track of what happened and be 100% sure that it's truthful. And what that means is that you, on this ledger, you can put things like security keys, instructions, private data, and you can be absolutely sure that the right people can look at it and not the wrong people. And that's really interesting in this age of, increasing cybersecurity threat and increasing concern about privacy and only the right people getting at the data. And so that's a part of the solution too. And there's a lot of people, not just finance people, that are really very interested in how we can use this stuff, and that's stuff that we're building. So that's it. I have the obligatory advertisement at the end. So there we are. Book, won awards, great. Tell us about a lot of this, the thinking underlying this stuff. $12 on Amazon. Thank you. Questions? We're almost on time here. No questions. You're all stunned. Okay, well, thank you all. Oh, one question, yes.
So talking about distributed security and being able to do your computation at a local level and then roll up to the aggregate, is there a way to combine some of our artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques to be able to say, all right, this is where all of the local data lives. I know the pathway, but I can have the pathway be such that nobody else can uninterrupt or figure out what that pathway is. How can we move from having the data localized and still being able to get to the scalability and the speed that we need where we have in a single place today?
So the question is if you have distributed data and the data knows what it is, how can you get the speed and convenience that you get out of having all the data in one spot? And the short answer that we're working on and have a solution to, right, is that there are, for 20 years or so, there's been this stuff called secure multi-party computation. And what that means is that instead of doing anonymization and stuff like that that are basically hacks and don't work, you can do things that have really strong guarantee that nobody can actually break it, ever, right? However, they've always been way too expensive to use. And what we've realized is that by looking at the patterns of computation, you can actually make it something that is scales linearly with problem size. So it takes maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times as long as what you do if you have it all in one spot, but only 3 or 4 times longer. And it's just computation time. It's not like human time, right? And that in many situations, that's going to be a reasonable trade-off. Right? And all of that overhead, almost all that overhead, happens in communication times. So as you get faster networks, that will go down too. Right? Happy to tell you about it. Yeah.
So thinking about the retail and the consumer space, do you see sort of a fundamental issue with the way that we're collecting data right now? In that most of the time we're collecting data, at the company level, but it only really makes sense sort of at the consumer level, right? So I might give my data to J.Crew and they know my size and the color and stuff that I'm buying, but really I want sort of all of the retail places that I'm shopping in to have access to that.
So he's asking about control of data and what makes sense. So for many years I've run a group at Davos that has helped shape the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and the Data Protection Acts in Europe. And the fundamental notion there is that the only place where all the data comes together, all the data about you comes together, is you. And that you ought to have more of a say in it. And for that to happen, there has to be some sort of data bank that your data ends up in and you can give permissions, just like you give permission to spend money or to invest money. And so we've built architectures like this. We had this panel yesterday of companies that are beginning to realize that if they're going to be in the data business, they have to involve the customer and have the attitude that the customer has given them a license to the data, not that they own the data. And that once you do that, it makes all sorts of security and privacy things really easy. The downside is you have to have this relationship with the customer, but what these guys were saying was, oh, you're going to have a better relationship with your customer? Why do you think that's bad? That makes you more sticky. So I think there's a sort of slow revolution that's happening, and that'll pick up paces as you begin to get companies that act as data brokers for you. Just like your bank is supposed to invest money, these guys will help you manage your data. And you're already seeing things like that out there. A friend of mine runs Reputation.com. There's a bunch of ones like that are beginning to sort of show the power of doing that. And as the regulation advances, and as cybersecurity becomes more important, I think this will become more and more of an obvious solution. So, okay? Great, thanks.